So what are secondary dominant chords, and how are jazz musicians using them to take their solos and their chords to the next level? Hey, Brent here from Learn Jazz Standards. Let's take a look first here at this very common jazz chord progression called the 1-6-2-5 chord progression. And in the key of concert C, it sounds like this: C major 7, A minor 7, D minor 7, G7. You'll see this come up all the time in jazz standards, as we'll take a look at in just a second. And in order to understand what a secondary dominant is, we first have to understand how these chord progressions work. Otherwise, we're just going to be confused from the very beginning. So even if this is review for you, please pay attention. So take a look at this major diatonic series of seventh chords here on the screen. Essentially, if you took a C major scale and you harmonized it with seventh chords, stacking thirds on top of that scale, you'd come up with this. C major 7 is the 1 chord, D minor 7 is the 2, E minor 7 is the 3, F major 7 is the 4, G7 is the 5, A minor 7 is the 6, and B minor 7 flat 5 is the 7. So when we talk about chord progressions using Roman numerals or numbers like 1, 6, 2, 5, we're literally taking it from this diatonic series. C major 7 is the 1 chord, A minor 7 is the 6 chord, D minor 7 is the 2 chord, and G7 is the 5 chord. Now that's important to understand because each one of these harmonizations within the scale have different qualities of chords. In the case of this 1-6-2-5, the 1 chord is always major, the 6 chord is always minor, the 2 chord is minor, and the 5 chord is always dominant. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, what is a secondary dominant and how can we apply them to this chord progression right here? So brace yourself for this definition of a secondary dominant. A secondary dominant is a dominant 7th chord that substitutes for a diatonic chord in the chord progression that functions to tonicize its preceding chord. Yeah, that sounded confusing, so let's just show you instead. That leads us to level 1 of the secondary dominance, which is called the 5 of 2. So in this example of the 1-6-2-5 chord progression, the D minor 7 is the 2 chord. Now remember, I said a secondary dominant is essentially a dominant 7th chord substituting another diatonic chord to tonicize another chord within the chord progression. So a 5 of 2 means we are going to tonicize this D minor 7. And what does tonicize mean? Tonicize means to temporarily make that chord feel like its own 1 chord, as if we're actually in the key of D minor and not in the key of C major. In a second, I'll explain why we'd want to do this in the first place. So the question is, how do we tonicize this D minor 7? Well, go ahead and first of all, before we do that, take a look at the 5 chord. Now, one thing that we know in jazz is that a 5 always goes to a 1 of some sort. And essentially that is the most common chord progression in all of music. 5 to 1. It is because of that 5 chord that we feel the resolution to that 1. We are tonicizing that 1. So if we wanted to tonicize this D minor 7, we just have to ask ourselves, what is the 5 chord in the key of D minor? Well, that's easy. It's A7. So we take this A minor 7 out of the equation on this 6 chord, and we substitute it instead for an A7 chord. Essentially, we are changing the quality from an A minor 7, which if we go back to our major diatonic series of 7th chords, we know the 6th chord is always a minor 7th chord. But now we're substituting that 6th chord for an A7 chord, which tonicizes the D minor 7. When we do that, we get a chord progression that sounds like this. And listen back there to that A7 to the D minor 7. A7 to D minor 7. It makes it sound for a moment there that the D minor 7 is its own 1 chord. If we really wanted to make that pop even more, we might add an altered extension like a flat 9 or a sharp 13 on that A7 to resolve to that D minor 7. Jazz musicians do this all of the time, and essentially they use it not only as a harmonic mechanism, they use it so that they can improvise different kinds of sounding solos that give a lot more tension and resolution. So for example, if we're just playing a regular, C major 7, A minor 7, right? D minor 7, G7, like all of that is great. That A minor 7 doesn't really have a defining sound other than it's in the key of C major. But as soon as we add that A7 into the picture, now we have a different sound. We have this sound where we're right, where we can make this tension and resolution sound. Right? This tension and resolution to a new 1 chord, which is really just the 2 chord in C major, but it's that temporary tonicization that makes it sound amazing. It gives you more options in your solos, more options in your chords, more options in your bass lines to really spice up the chords. So where would we see a 5 of 2? Well, for example, this plays out all the time in tunes like rhythm changes. So in this case, this is the jazz standard Olio, which is a rhythm changes head by Sonny Rollins. And you'll notice that the primary changes for a rhythm changes are a 1, dominant 6, 2, 5. In this case, in B flat major, so 1, dominant 6, 2, 5. So in this case, the G7 is tonicizing the C minor 7, the 5 of 2. And that, my friends, is what a secondary dominant is. Don't worry, let's go over some more levels of secondary dominance and you'll understand this concept even more. But if any of the music theory I'm throwing around, like chord progressions and Roman numerals and numbers and stuff like that, is confusing you, I also have a free guide for you called our Jazz Theory Made Easy Fast Track Guide. I'll leave that in the description down below. You can get that for free, and that guide will pretty much get you covered as far as the basic theory you need to know for jazz. So check that out in the description down below. Level 2 is the 5 of 6. Now, the 5 of 6 can actually also be found in rhythm changes, just as we saw the 5 of 2 there. We just have to go down to the bridge of this tune, which starts with the D7. And this whole passage sounds like this. To the top of the A section. Now the 6th chord is right here. It's this G7 here. Now remember, the 6th chord, right, is actually a minor 7th chord. So as you can see, just by making this dominant here, it means that it's also acting as a 5 of 2 over here with the C7, which is acting as a 5 of 5, which we'll get there in 1 second. But the 5 of 6 is right here with the 3 chord, which is D7. Now, a 3 chord, going back to our diatonic series of 7th chords, is always C minor 7, D minor 7 is the 2 chord, E minor 7 is the 3 chord. Or in the case of B flat major is the 1 chord, C minor 7 is the 2 chord, and D minor 7 is the 3 chord, right? But now we're changing this to a dominant 7th chord because we are now going to tonicize this 6th chord here. So we're making it sound like a new 1 chord. We have a dominant 7th chord there, resolving to a G7 chord. Now let's just say and pretend for a second that this G7 is actually just its regular minor 7th. Well, then you really hear that especially come out. You hear the dominant 7-3 chord resolving to the 6th chord, and it makes the 6th chord sound like a 1 chord. That's the whole idea of secondary dominance, making a diatonic chord within the chord progression sound like a new 1 chord, even if just for a measure or 2. That leads us to level 3, which is the 5 of 5. Now, a great example of this is in this tune called But Not For Me. It's one of the tunes we've studied in my Inner Circle membership. And again, if we are having a 5 of 5, it means that the 5 chord is what is actually being tonicized. Now, this is the most meta of secondary dominance because I guess the whole thing is the 5 chord is always tonicizing another chord. it's a dominant 7th chord. So it's kind of a funny experience to essentially tonicize the 5 chord, which is really just tonicizing another chord. However, this comes up a lot in jazz compositions and is also sometimes superimposed with improvisation. So in this particular case of But Not For Me, which sounds like this, first chord is an F7 chord in the key of E flat major. Remember, the 2 chord is normally a minor 7th chord, but we are tonicizing this B flat 7, so we turn it into a dominant 7th chord, and now it is the 5 of 5. So while this is a funny one to think about, it actually does come up in quite a few tunes. For example, But Not For Me. This leads us to level 4, which is the 5 of 4. But Not For Me is another example where you can see the 5 of 4, and this happens a lot in jazz standards, so make sure you're paying attention here. The 4 chord in the key of E flat major is A flat major, okay? So what we're essentially saying is, what is the 5 of A flat major? The 5 of A flat major is this chord right here, the E flat 7 chord. Now we know that in the key of E flat major is actually the 1 chord. But when we're taking that E flat major chord and instead turning it into a dominant 7th chord, now it's tonicizing this A flat major chord. Again, A flat major is still the 4 chord in E flat major, but simply by substituting out our E flat major 1 chord to a dominant 7, we're making this E flat 7 tonicize the A flat major 7 4 chord. Now again, I talk a lot more about important jazz theory you need to know in my Jazz Theory Made Easy Fast Track Guide. So definitely go get that guide, link in the description up here on the screen, will really help you out. In addition, by the way, one of the best ways to learn about jazz theory is very simply to learn more jazz standards, and that's the main thing we do in our Inner Circle membership. We learn 1 new jazz standard a month and give you all the tools you need in order to do that. So also leave that on the screen in the description down below if you're interested in checking that out. That's all for today's video. If you like this video, hit that like button. Please subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.